All right. Hi, everyone. It looks like we have a good number of people on so far. So welcome to another session of the Spring Immigration Workshop virtually. Happy to have you all here. Basically, I'm just going to go over what the Zoom kind of house rules and what to do. So you are on, in case you didn't know, that everything you ever wanted to know about non-resident tax but were afraid to ask. I know taxes is one of our beloved subjects that we get questions about, but it's really not our area of expertise. So I'm happy to have here today Neil Duffy, who's the Associate Vice President of Sprint Tax, which I know a lot of us use their services, and Colleen Callahan-Pandey, who's the Director of the Office of International Student Life at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and has a particular passion for taxes and helping students with taxes. So we're going to go ahead. If you can go to the next slide. Go over some of the Zoom house rules. So one thing we would say is it's helpful if you make sure your name is what you want us to know you by, and what university or institution, or if you're a student, whatever you want to add to your name, if it would be helpful. You can have your video on, it's not required, but we welcome that if you'd like to. Just make sure you're muted. I think all of you were entered as muted when you came in. And feel free to connect with colleagues through the chat throughout. We'll be monitoring the chat and looking for questions, and feel free to share, or we try to make this as interactive as we can over Zoom, and we're anticipating about 50 or 60 people, and ask those questions. And as far as everything else, we just want to put a plug for the rest of SIW. And again, this is on behalf of GRAC, which is the Government Regulations Advisory Committee. Wait, is that? I never get that right. The Government Regulatory Advisory Committee, and we are here to do educational things. We usually have the SIW in person, so we're happy to still be able to provide some educational material for you and connect and network. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Neil and Colleen and let you go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thanks so much, and hi everyone. We're delighted to be asked to come here and present today. For anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Neil and I'm a representative from Sprint Tax. And if anyone doesn't know Sprint Tax, it is a non-resident tax preparation software. And I'm delighted today to present with Colleen Callahan-Pandey.
Thank you. So I'm Colleen. I work at WPI. So for those of you who attended the Spring Immigration Workshop last year, it was basically the last thing any of us probably did before the world shut down on March 9th. And I have been doing tax advising at WPI for probably about a dozen years, give or take. And I'm really happy to talk with you all today.
Great. So let's jump into the presentation then. So just, I suppose, in terms of the housekeeping, we kind of already went over this, but the session will be recorded, so we'll get that out to you. And also, just because we have the hour, feel free to ask any questions you want. You can put them into the chat, or at the end, we might unmute everyone, and then you can just ask us straight out. But as always, we definitely appreciate any feedback that you have. So for anyone that's seen this presentation before, we do always start with a disclaimer. And it is just to say that we'll be talking about non-resident tax in a very general way. And obviously every situation can be different depending on the non-resident, depending on the student. So really it's not until we sit down with someone and look at the details that we can accurately advise on their tax circumstances. But for the sake of this presentation, we're giving you a very broad and general overview of the tax principles that do apply. So quickly, in terms of the overview, we'll look at the basic tax questions that non-residents might ask you. We're gonna have a look at the kind of the tax behavior of international students and scholars from last year, the implications of filing an incorrect tax return, and then kind of looking at kind of a case study and looking at kind of the supports that are available right now, but also that some schools do provide. And then obviously we'll also look at the COVID impact piece. So first up, it's kind of the most important piece, and it's kind of the piece we get the most questions on. So it's really, this is kind of key to, I'd say, a lot of the questions that your office would get, and what determines residency for tax purposes. or else students coming to you asking, am I a resident or a non-resident? So first off, it's important to note that obviously for most of your international students, they're going to be considered non-residents for immigration purposes. But the two aren't linked in any way. And when it comes to taxes, it's all based on the number of days you spent in the US. So in a lot of cases, we might have an international student that's a non-resident for immigration purposes, but they could be a resident for tax purposes, which sometimes can be a struggle for some students to understand. And really, it's just important to reiterate that it's based on the number of days they're actually in the US. Now, there are a couple of basic general rules that apply to international students. And the first is for anybody that's on a J1 or an F1 student visa, the general rule from the IRS is that they'll be considered a non-resident for tax purposes for their first 5 years in the US. So after that non-resident then goes past that 5-year period, so year 6, the IRS will then say, okay, they're no longer exempt. Let's look at the substantial presence test. And essentially the substantial presence test it's a maths equation, and it looks at the last 3 years they were in the US, and it looks to see if their total days of presence equate to 183 days. So what was that particular student physically in the US for 183 days? If they were, they'll then be considered a resident for tax purposes. Now, if you have anyone that is a J1 researcher or scholar or any of the kind of other J1 visas, there's a different rule outside of that 5-year rule. And instead of 5 years, the IRS will generally give 2 years out of 6, where they'll be considered a non-resident for tax purposes. And again, after they go past that 2-year period, again, the IRS will look at the substantial presence test, and they'll say, well, you're no longer exempt, automatically exempt for those 2 years. So if you were here for more than 183 days, you'll be considered, again, a resident for tax purposes. Now, in a lot of cases, this is an easy one to resolve. And I would say there's a helpful tool online on the SprintTax website. And even if someone comes to me, if they're a user of SprintTax and they say, look, I don't know if I'm a resident versus non-resident, and they'll start to give me their visa information and their days of presence, I would always say, first off, you need to go to SprintTax. And it's this first step is a free tool essentially, whereby anyone can register an account. Anyone can go through step 1 and enter their first name, enter their information, but more importantly, give us their entry and exit dates. And once that student goes in, enters their entry and exit dates, we'll tell them if they're a resident or a non-resident. And the software will look at their visa type and every other condition that's important and give them an answer that we know is 100% accurate. If they're found to be a resident for tax purposes, we'll stop the software and we'll show a big pop-up that says you should go and use a software like TurboTax because SprintTax can assist you. If they're a non-resident, we'll just leave them on to step 2. So that's probably a good kind of trick for everyone to know. Colleen, would you kind of agree with me there that this generally tends to be...
that's almost exactly what we do. So at WPI, and we'll talk a little bit more about WPI specifically and what we do for tax purposes, but we do tax workshops, and this is a major theme of our tax workshop. I always start out by saying, if you take nothing away from this workshop today, I want you to walk away knowing what your tax status is and when it's going to change and understanding when that timeline might be. But the 5-year thing is pretty easy if somebody is coming in directly from abroad and they've never been here before. But if they have been here before, and there might be kind of multiple visits that we'll calculate in, we always direct them to SprintTax. I joke that my students must think I make a commission from SprintTax because I say, I trust the software. Just go to the software. It will tell you whether you're a non-resident or a resident, and it will stop you if you shouldn't be filling it out. The other thing I wanted to mention, and we'll talk a little bit about this, I think, later on, the other softwares that are out there, at least until this past tax year, TurboTax and H&R Block, they don't stop you from filling it out. They don't really ask the right question to stop a student from filling it out if they're a non-resident alien. So the student might go to one of these websites because they think their buddy in their lab or something like this tells them, oh, you've never done taxes before, why don't you go use TurboTax? I use it, it's very simple. And they think they're doing the right thing, and they don't realize they're committing tax fraud because they're never stopped. So it's important for them to know that there are the right softwares to use depending on the tax status you're in. And that's another reason why it's important for you to understand which status you're in.
Yeah, it's a good point on the TurboTax piece. You know, every year we kind of meet them just to see if there's anything that can be done there in terms of kind of not processing residents. And it's really a case that it's such a small minority that any changes they make on the software, they wouldn't do it because it's such a small group of people. But it is a pity. It's definitely how a lot of non-residents and students get caught out.
And similarly, if a student decided not to use SprintTax, for instance, as a non-resident, we always tell them that if you're going to like talk to an accountant or something like this, make sure they know at the very beginning that they're a non-resident alien. Because again, non-resident alien paperwork is a little bit of a niche for these folks. And not everybody understands some of the ins and outs of non-resident paperwork. So make sure if a student does decide to go and talk to somebody, that person knows right away, I'm a non-resident. I need to fill out the NR forms. I can't just do the regular 1040.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Just, I suppose on that then, this is kind of a useful chart, and you'll see this in the recording anyway. But this breaks down based on the visa type, which exemptions apply. So you'll see up top there, the F1 and the F2 visas and the J1 student visas all have that 5-year exemption. And essentially all the other J1 visas have the 2-year exemption. So that's probably good to know. So who actually needs to file something then for 2020? Well, first thing to know is that if you have a non-resident and they've spent any time whatsoever in the US during 2020, they'll need to file at a minimum Form 8843. And again, that's something that many international students don't realize. They're thinking, well, I haven't earned any income, so for that reason, I don't have any filing requirements. The minimum is really Form 8843, which does apply to everyone. And then after that, then if they start to earn any income, so let's say they earn over, and it's essentially over $0, that's the threshold. So if they earned 50 cents or $1 in income, they'll then trigger a federal filing requirement. And after that, then, if they, depending on the state they live in, if they meet the state filing thresholds, they also might have a state filing requirement. Just in terms of updates on kind of the forms, there's no longer 1040 NREZ, which I'm sure everybody would have been familiar with, that would have worked on taxes, just because it generally was the most common form for non-residents. This year, everything is done under the 1040 NR. So I know, Colleen, you mentioned that, you know, if someone is using a different provider or maybe a CPA, you say that's kind of niche forms. This is kind of something that I would always say to them. I would say, well, you know, you can use whoever you want, but just make sure that the form you get at the end of it is 1040 NR as a non-resident. So really the important point from this slide is that everybody does need to do something. And that basic filing requirement is Form 8843. And Form 8843, it's a fairly straightforward form. It asks you for some basic information, your first name, last name, the number of days you've been present in the US, and then obviously your visa information. Now, as a non-resident, if you have a federal or state filing requirement, you'll need a tax number, but Form 8843 is the exception to that. Colleen, just in terms of kind of how you manage the Form 8843s, just kind of within your institution, I know you've got some kind of good tips and tricks on that.
Yeah, so every year I download a copy of the updated 8843 and I fill it out as an example, and I scan it and I put it on our tax website, and we point students towards that. So if they only need to fill out the 8843, we have an example right up on our website that students can follow and use, because they really just need to fill out part 1, they skip part 2, they fill out part 3, and then they just have to sign on the second page. So it's a pretty straightforward form. And we try and make it as simple as possible. And every year when we talk about the 8843, inevitably we'll have people in the audience at the tax workshop that'll say, oh my gosh, I've been here for 2 or 3 years. I had no idea I had to do this in the past. Am I in trouble? Is the government going to come after me? And so you can fill out the 8843 from previous years. The IRS actually has a website, a section of their website where they have all the previous 8843 forms down to 1993. So you can go in, download the previous forms. The real change is just the date. And so they can fill them out from previous years. And I usually have them stick a little note on top of it explaining that they didn't realize they needed to do this in the past and they're filling them out this year. And then they can submit them all together so that they're kind of all set to go. So it's definitely fixable. I mean, that's one thing about taxes, which are nice. I mean, you can't indefinitely not fix your taxes, but there is a window of time that students can fix things if they didn't know in the past what they needed to do.
Definitely, and definitely with 8843 without any fines or penalties either, which is nice for them to know. Great. So next up then we'll look at kind of state taxes, and we kind of touched on this, but you can have a federal filing requirement, you'll have a form 8843 filing requirement, and then depending on the state you live in, you'll also have a state filing requirement. And then depending on the state you live in, there's rules on whether you're a part-year resident or a non-resident or a full-time resident, all depending on how long you've stayed in that state, or there might be rules on if you own a property there or if you're physically there. But again, I suppose it's important to know which states that student was in. Maybe in a lot of cases, because of COVID, a really common theme that we're seeing at the moment is that students have left their state where they're typically studying. Florida is the popular one that we're seeing. Seems like a lot of students have headed off to Florida and have studied from there online. That's probably an easier one because there's no state taxes in Florida. But in some cases that might get messy depending on where they've went to. So it's just important for them to be aware of that they may trigger other state filing requirements depending on where they've actually moved to. So the important dates then to remember. So again, I think most people know this, but it's important to reiterate to the student anyway. It runs the same as the calendar year respect to the tax year, in that everything the student should focus on is the 1st of January to the 31st of December 2020. It's really their income within that period. So when they're doing their tax returns, sometimes it can get a bit overwhelming, and they're bringing in their W-2s from 2 years ago or the income they've earned from January on. It's important just to reiterate, focus on nothing else but that income from 2020.
We let folks know too about like 8843. If they arrived early for a January start date and came in before December 31st, they also need to file the 8843, even if in their head they're thinking, I've not been here for 2020 because I started in January. If they physically arrived earlier than December 31st, 11:59 on December 31st, they have to come. I actually tell my students a story. My 3-year-old son was born December 31st, 2017. And I said, he was only here for a few hours, but he counted for the entire tax year.
It's true, and they do look at it in that way. It's a good way of putting it. The other piece then is just the actual filing deadline. And this year that's Thursday, April the 15th. Now I know probably everyone's wondering, is it going to be pushed out again? Is it going to be 3 months? We've been told that it's not going to be pushed out. That there isn't an expectation that it will be, but again, that might change last minute. But I think for now we're probably expecting that it won't be pushed out, which would probably be nice. Great. So what income then triggers a filing requirement, and how does the IRS actually define income? So as everyone can probably imagine, from their own experience, it's fairly broad, and it's everything from your employment or your wages or your salary to a scholarship covering areas outside of tuition. So if you have a student that has received a scholarship and that scholarship covered tuition, but it also covered their room and board, or maybe it covered some expenses, or if they're in New York, maybe a Metro card. In that case, if it's areas outside of tuition, that will be taxable. And the student should expect to receive an income document for the areas that's outside of tuition. Unearned income then, and this is again a really common one that's coming up lately. I think Robinhood is definitely a trend everywhere, and we're definitely seeing that on the webinars that we've been hosting recently. And students will ask, well, do I owe income on my Robinhood or any other trading platform stock? And the answer is, if you've made money on it, then absolutely you should get an income document for that, and you will get an income document for that, and you can use that on your non-resident tax return. Other than kind of more obscure income, and I'll use a few examples, and I might hand it over to Colleen then, who has kind of a few good examples there. But singing in a bar, gambling winnings, if one of your students went to Vegas and won money there, they'll need to pay tax on that. It's considered US income technically. A focus group, if they gave blood or they did a focus group and got a $20 gift card, technically that's considered US income. They'll need to pay tax on that. Rental income, if you have a student that maybe left their apartment and they put it on Airbnb and it was on Airbnb for more than 14 nights, they'll get an income document for that. And Colleen, I know selling goods online is kind of one that you've come across a couple of times.
Yeah, I mean, in the work authorization world for F1 students, I feel like the landscape keeps changing. The students kind of come up with these ideas faster than the government regulations can regulate them. I've had an instance in the last few years where I think two different students, they were sneaker aficionados, and I guess they collect these like pricey sneakers, and then once they get new additions to their collections, they sell them online. And I guess if you sell something up beyond a certain amount through PayPal, that would actually generate a tax form, a 1099-K, and that is documented income. So we talk to the students about, being careful for anything that might be considered work authorization, and now you have documentation for this. But once that document is issued to you, you definitely need to file that with your taxes. So, it's important for students to know that things might not feel like it will be considered taxable income, like selling sneakers online, but it can, and it could generate tax forms that will come through the mail and surprise you during this season.
Definitely. And as you said, for any of those kind of big guys like eBay or Amazon, they generally tend to issue those tax documents, but where it gets confusing is where you might have that focus group and where they actually need to make the omission that they have actually received that income. That's where there might even be more confusion. So now that we looked at what triggers a filing requirement, let's look at income which does not trigger a filing requirement as a non-resident. And the first is for a scholarship for tuition. And we say related expenses, that's very limited, but we do need to say that anyway. If your scholarship covers tuition and nothing else, then the IRS don't need to know about it. It's not taxable, and that international student will never receive an income document for it. But again, going back to the example of that student who has earned a scholarship for tuition, but also areas outside of tuition, that's when it becomes taxable. And it's not the tuition that's taxable, it's the areas outside of tuition. A scholarship received from outside the US. So really, you'll see a common theme here that the IRS as a non-resident are only concerned with income earned within the US. So if you have a scholarship received from outside the US, let's say Ireland, and because I earned that back in Ireland, the IRS aren't really concerned with that. It's not considered US income as a non-resident. So again, you don't need to put that on your non-resident tax return. Money transferred from parents or relatives overseas, again, they're paying, more than likely paying tax on that back in their home country. So as a non-resident, you can receive as much money as you want from your parents or relatives without it having a tax implication. And then same, income earned in your home country. In a lot of cases, non-residents will save up money before they come to the US, bring it over with them, put it in their US bank account. And similar enough, because it was earned outside the US, it doesn't trigger a filing requirement. Now, if that person becomes a resident, those rules are completely changed, and the IRS want to know about absolutely everything. So you can tell them that they're pretty lucky as a non-resident that these rules do apply. And the last one then is interest on a regular checking or savings account. Generally, as J1 or an F1 student, you're exempt from paying tax on that interest.
So we, around this time, we've tried to train our students to come and talk to our office if they receive any government document or a bank document or anything like that, that they're just not sure what it is. Come talk to us before you take action on it. So around this time, they get 1099 INTs. Those are the bank interest documents that they receive for their taxes. So if they come in asking you, what's the 1099 INT? What do I need to do with it? If you're a non-resident, you don't need to do anything with it.
Yeah, just a bit of reassurance, I suppose, isn't it? Great. So tax documents then that your non-residents kind of should be aware of, really. So a W-2 is the first one. I think everyone's aware of that, and it kind of covers their wages, their salary, or their compensation. The only thing that might be might be worth mentioning is that if you have an international student working multiple jobs, they should expect to receive multiple W-2s. In some cases, if they receive just one W-2 and they're waiting on the second one, they might just go in and prepare their taxes and send it to the IRS before actually receiving their second one. The 1042S document then, that's really a document that covers that taxable scholarship we mentioned a while ago. It also covers any income that's covered under a tax treaty, and can also cover some areas like royalty payments, stipends, non-degree aid, or if you're issued with a prize or an award. Generally, for sites like online, so we mentioned Amazon, we mentioned Robinhood. If websites like that know that an international student is a non-resident, they should really be issuing a 1042S if a tax treaty applies. In most cases, that won't happen, and a 1099 will be issued. And that's why you'll see the 1099 generally tends to cover everything else, that rental income from Airbnb, that investment income, or if they worked as an independent contractor.
So we get a lot of questions from students. They get their W-2 or their 1042S, and they come in and they always ask us, how do I fill this out? And so we explain to them, it's not something you fill out. You have to think of it as the answer key to your tax paperwork. You're using the W-2 as the answer key so that when you go to SprintTax, or if you're filling out the form yourself, that's where you're going to get your answers to fill in the forms. You don't actually fill anything in on the W-2 or the 1042 itself.
Great. Next up then, non-resident spouse and dependents. So again, there might be confusion there if you have a non-resident international student that's here also with their spouse that's a non-resident. They might think they could file together. As a non-resident in the US, they always need to file separately. And the IRS really requests that they even send those documents in separate envelopes, even if they prepare them together. The same rules that apply to your non-resident spouse and dependent also applies to, same rules that apply to international student also applies to the spouse and dependent, which means that even if they were here for a couple of days, they'll also need to fill out Form 8843. And again, if they earned any US income, they'll trigger a federal and possibly a state, depending on the state that they live in. So the same rules apply. And one area that a lot of international students don't know is, regardless of the age of their dependent, they'll still need to fill out Form 8843. So even if that's a child, even if it's a baby, they're still expected to complete Form 8843 for them. FICA taxes then, and this is again kind of an important enough one for any student that might be going on OPT. I think most people are probably aware of FICA, but it's that tax where if you're 65 years of age and you need assistance paying your medical bills, FICA will assist you with that. But as the IRS look at international students, they kind of think, well, you're not going to be here at the age of 65, or it's very unlikely you'll retire here in the US. So for that reason, again, there's a general rule that if you're on a J1 or an F1 student visa, you're exempt from paying FICA, which is great. That's obviously the rule, but it doesn't always apply to everyone, in that you might have a student that goes on OPT. They might go to an organization with 1,000 employees. They might be one of 10 non-residents, and the payroll office treat them the same as everybody else, which means that FICA taxes and Medicare and Social Security will all be withheld from their wages incorrectly. Now, if that does happen, the student can wait to do their tax return, apply for it back, and then request a FICA refund. Now, the IRS will first request that they go directly to their employer and request for that refund back directly. Doesn't always work. I'd say most of the time they'll need to request that back directly from the IRS. Now, FICA refunds notoriously take a lot longer than federal refunds. And this year, federal refunds took extremely long. So you can imagine how long FICA refunds have been taken. And in a lot of cases, we're seeing that I'd say the majority of FICA refunds that we've worked with still haven't been processed by the IRS. There's probably still a couple of months left in them. So for that reason, in a lot of cases, these international students, they're making good money, but not a massive ton of it. So it's important that they do get as much as possible into their monthly or their weekly wages if they can. And that really means, first of all, communicating with the payroll office, whether that be in the school or whether that be their new employer, and ensuring that the right paperwork is submitted to them. And that could mean, and again, it'll depend on the student, and the payroll office will really direct this, but that could mean submitting a W8BEN or an 8233 or a W4, depending on what's asked of them. So ITINs are another one that COVID haven't been too kind to. An ITIN, for anyone that doesn't know, is an individual taxpayer identification number. And it's a number that applies to somebody that has triggered a filing requirement, but is not eligible to work in the US. So to give an example of that, I'm going to go back to that scholarship I mentioned a while ago, where that first year student was receiving a scholarship for tuition in areas outside of tuition. Now, technically, that student isn't eligible to work in the US. So for that reason, they're not eligible to apply for a social security number. But because they have a taxable scholarship, they'll need to apply for an ITIN in order to file their federal or state tax return. So that's really where an ITIN becomes very common. To be approved an ITIN, you need to complete Form W7, but the IRS then require that your documents are certified. So essentially, they know that you are the actual person that's applying for the tax identification number. Because that also needs to be done in person, but because this year, because most of the IRS offices are closed, that's becoming a real issue, and a lot of students weren't actually able to receive an ITIN. If you have a student that's overseas and they're not able to get their documents certified, unfortunately, there isn't a great resolution to that. And the IRS are given the options to either go to the person that issued the passport, so that typically that's in your home country, and typically during COVID, they won't be taking appointments anyway. Or else you can send the documents actually with your W7, the actual physical documents, which is obviously a horrible idea, and nobody should ever do that, really. But unfortunately, outside of that, and it's not a great resolution, some students might just have to wait if they can't actually receive an ITIN, and they can't send in their documents until they receive that ITIN. 1098T, then, it's always good to mention this slide just as a quick refresher. Form 1098T is an educational tax credit that applies to residents. And if you're a resident and you use a software like TurboTax, you'll receive $1,000 as a tax credit. Now, as a non-resident, you're not permitted to use this, and SprintTax won't ask about this if they are using our software. But in a lot of cases, you might have a student use TurboTax in error and say that they have received this document. Really, it shouldn't be issued to non-residents, but we see it being issued quite a bit if a payroll office have a social security number on file. Generally, that tends to be a trigger to issue it, regardless of whether they're a resident or a non-resident. Colleen, would you see this kind of being a trending issue within your office?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly if something changed about 2 or 3 years ago, but I have found at WPI that they didn't used to do the 1098Ts for the most part for international students, but now they're like casting a wider net. So they're giving them out to more people than they might actually need to give them out to because they're worried about compliance issues. So a lot of our students, if they have a social security number on file, are getting these 1098T documents, and then they think they need to do something. And I believe the email that they get says something like, you need to do something under penalty of something or other. And the email sounds scary. So then the students really feel like they need to do something. And we have to have conversations with them about not having to do anything if you're a non-resident alien.
Yeah, and I can imagine that's a tough conversation for you as well, advising that you can't use it and you can't get that $1,000 back. And even, we see that even on emails that we receive. A lot of non-residents who are aware of this tax credit will kind of give it out saying, well, it's an error in the software that you don't ask for this, and I want to apply it. So it's always good to kind of set the expectation that as a non-resident, there's really very few tax credits you can and will receive. And this, unfortunately, is one of them.
Yeah, we were both kind of joking earlier that we've both separately used the example of Al Capone for our students. We say, hey, do you guys know who Al Capone is? He was a pretty bad guy. He did a lot of bad things, but what the government finally got him on wasn't all those murders and things like that, but tax fraud. And so not that we're thinking the FBI is going to go after everybody in the same way that they'd go after Al Capone. It is an example of why it's really important to make sure that you are always making sure you're doing your paperwork correctly. And certainly there's immigration implications as well. If you're filing for green cards or further immigration benefits, that they could look at the previous years, several years. We were talking about, you could go back further than 3 years, but 3 years is pretty standard, your tax paperwork. And so we want to always make sure that they're filing things correctly, because they don't know 3 years into the future where they're actually going to be and if they'll be filing paper.
Definitely. Okay, so next up, and again, forms that you should just be aware of to advise that they're not really relevant. Form 1095 A, B, and C series. It basically depends on how you receive your healthcare. And Form 1095A can be applicable in very, very small circumstances. It's very, very rare. Actually, the only time I've really see it being applicable is at this spring immigration workshop for a school. But other than that, I really haven't seen any international students really receive this. It's very, very rare that they will. And Form 1095B and C series, they don't apply as a non-resident. You can't claim anything back with these forms. And if they're using an online provider, generally they'll advise them that you don't need to use these forms. So timelines for a refund. So normally we'd say 6 weeks is the kind of average, and then the IRS give themselves up to 6 months, but that's very unusual. This year, again, we really don't know how long it's going to take this year. We're hoping that it's back to normal times, 6 weeks, but just be aware that there may be a slight delay compared to normal. And in a lot of cases, it's just about, I suppose, everybody just being aware of that and setting the expectation that you just kind of need to sit tight for that refund in comparison to previous years. So let's look at the COVID impact piece then, and kind of the stimulus payments piece, which is really a hot topic at the moment. And we've given this example. Now, it mightn't be the most relevant to international offices. It might be more relevant to payroll offices, but it's good for everyone to be aware of it anyway. And in this example, we said that it's an F1 student that is on a basketball scholarship, and they were due to receive a scholarship and a weekly stipend for food into their US bank account for being a member of the team. Now, this particular student had to return home to France before the scholarship actually kicked in. And the school are considering covering their tuition and paying the stipends into the US bank account anyway. Now, they're studying online and they hope to return to the US, we said, in January 2021. So essentially, they were receiving a scholarship last year. They were never in the US for it, but the school issued it anyway, which we're seeing as really, really common. In some cases, we had a school in New York who issue a living stipend here, which is quite a generous living stipend. And when students went back to their home country, they decided to continue issuing that stipend. So in a lot of cases, if you have someone that was studying in New York and back to their home country, that's quite a lot of money to be receiving if they're living at home back in their home country. But we'd say for this, kind of how to break that down really is, first, we always look at their residency. Are they a resident versus non-resident? And again, are they within that 5-year rule? If they're a non-resident, which most international students should be, then we'll look at the type of income. So again, because it's a scholarship covering areas outside of tuition and a stipend, technically it is taxable. And then we'll look at the source of income. So in this case, the student hasn't been in the US at all in 2020. And because they haven't basically undertaken the activity of that scholarship in the US, it's technically considered foreign source income, and that they may not trigger a US filing requirement. Now, the issue with that is they may, and more than likely will, trigger a local filing requirement. And that's kind of where things get a bit messy this year. If you have a student that might have went back to the UK or France or Ireland, in a lot of cases, if they're there for more than 30 days and earning income there, they'll trigger filing requirements. And it'll also trigger a filing requirement for the school or the issuing agent to also file documents there. So I think a lot of schools and a lot of payroll offices are kind of, and we kind of did a poll on this, and I think 50% are kind of putting their head in the sand and saying, we'll deal with that when it comes. But if everything was right, really every payroll, every school should know exactly where their students are actually receiving that scholarship. And then based on that, looking at actually what do we need to do in terms of paperwork for that local region. And if that doesn't happen, and let's say there is an audit in that local region, there may be fines or penalties for the school. So I think everyone's kind of super conscious of that this year. And I suppose hoping that next year it won't be as complicated. So the stimulus check then, again, that's obviously a really common occurrence this year, and it's something that we've received a ton of questions on. Obviously, it's received a lot of headlines also, particularly for any of the non-residents that have received the stimulus payment in error. Just I suppose as an overview, if you have a non-resident, they're not eligible to receive that stimulus payment. And anyone that submitted form 1040 NR or 1040 NR EZ, which is our EZ last year, which was the non-resident forms, could pretty much guarantee that they shouldn't have received it. Now, we have a lot of students coming to us saying, well, I received this payment, but I'm considered a non-resident. And we normally break it down. We say, okay, so who did you file with last year, or what documents did you submit? Basically trying to figure out, did they file as a resident? And in every single case, they've always filed as a resident in error, which I think is a very easy mistake to make, in that, you know yourself, if you're in the US during filing season, every second advert is for TurboTax or H&R Block. So it's easy for an international student to make that mistake and think they can use TurboTax. But it's not until Form 1040 is submitted for them and they've received the $1,000 educational credit, they've received the first stimulus check for $1,200, second stimulus check for $600, and maybe another stimulus check for $1,400. They're kind of thinking, okay, this is a lot of money to be taken incorrectly from the IRS and the US government. So in fairness to most international students, the minute they realize this is an error, they've been really, really proactive. And there's always a way to correct that error. We can create an amended tax return, which is form 1040X, and then a correct tax form, which is 1040 NR. And that'll essentially fix the error they've made in their past tax return. Now that still leaves the actual payment they received, and they'll still need to give that payment back. So we've done a blog on it, which really breaks down the step-by-step actions they need to take in order to send that payment back. So I might put that in the chat in a couple of minutes. But if any of your students are worried about that payment, you can send them to that blog that we've posted, and it'll give them a very clear breakdown. And again, they're not alone. It's a very common issue this year. You know, in 2019, we amended 770 returns. In 2020, we amended 5,500, and that's probably closer to 6,000 now. It's such a common issue, but in fairness, everybody is working hard to get that error corrected. You know, as an international student, for the most part, they're not trying to get additional money or cheat the system. It was an honest mistake. So it is important that they get that fixed as soon as possible. Great, so that's kind of the tax piece. I might hand it over now to Colleen to kind of give an overview of kind of what they do in WPI and kind of a case study on it.
Good, thank you. So first of all, I just want to say preemptively that my kids were fighting in the background, so I think they're quiet now, but if you hear anything, I apologize preemptively. Okay, so I'm at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, as I mentioned before. We're the Office of International Student Life, also known as the International House. And if you go to the next slide, we have about 1,200 international students on campus when it's non-COVID crazy times, and about 600 to 700 students on OPT throughout the year, because we're a science, engineering, business school, so many of our students are on STEM OPT. We have about 74 students represented, so there's a few of our students doing a program in the fall with their masks on. You can go to the next slide. All right, so I just wanted to show some of the things that we do at WPI. So I think one thing that we do that maybe some other schools don't do is we're really proactive with a tax workshop that we do annually. So we do one in February, one in March, and one in April. And the main goal of the tax workshop is really to have students get some foundational knowledge about basic stuff. I am not an accountant. I don't have a background in accounting. I'm frankly not even very good at math, but I I want to make sure that they have some general concepts under their belt. So like I mentioned earlier, one of the main things I want them to take away from that workshop is that they understand if they're a non-resident or a resident, and they understand when that residency might change. We also talk a lot about FICA as well. We have a lot of internships that happen at our university while students are still students on CPT. And so we want to make sure that we plant the seed early, that if they do some work and they're still a non-resident alien, they don't have to pay that FICA tax, because it can add up. It's from each and every paycheck. So if depending on how much you earn, it can be a lot. And unlike some of the taxes that are out there, like a tax treaty benefit, where if you get it at the front end or you get it on the back end, it's pretty easy to have that sorted. Or getting your refund if you're taxed a little bit too much throughout the year. The FICA is really just a pain in the butt to try and get back. It seems to be the lowest priority the IRS has. And Neil and I were talking in preparation for this workshop, and it seems like right now it's about like 12 to 14 months at this point to try and get a FICA return. So we have a lot of students that are saying like, where's my money? Where's my money? So if they don't have it taken from the beginning, because they can talk to their payroll when they start working to say, I'm a non-resident alien, I'm a non-resident for tax purposes, I'm exempt from FICA, and can I not have this put onto my paycheck from the very beginning? That's usually pretty good. So those are some of the big things that we talk about in the tax workshop. We're not going line by line on a form. It's really important for people to know that we're not tax professionals and we can't go line by line. And that can be really hard, because then once you just have a little bit of knowledge, the students want to ask you 10,000 questions and get really nitty gritty and into the weeds with you. And you really can't, you have to hold the line. But I do find our tax workshops really helpful. And it also helps with spreading the word. So students come to those tax workshops and they hear about the 8843, and we tell them, when you leave here, go home to your dorm, talk to your fellow friends that, the 8843, even if they didn't work, they have to do it. So we try and spread out the knowledge and hit them multifaceted, because we of course do newsletters and email reminders, but we all know that students don't always read. We have pretty extensive information on our website for our office, and whether or not students actually look at that too. So the tax workshop is a way for us to kind of be face-to-face with people. We've been, of course, recording everything that we've been doing this year. We have a Canvas page for our university, and so we're able to put those recordings up there with our PowerPoint slides, and that kind of helps the students find the information at 2 o'clock in the morning when they're finally doing their tax paperwork, or whenever they're doing their work, where they can find some additional resources. We've been using SprintTax for many years, probably about 5 or 6 years now. Whenever SprintTax started, we were one of the earlier adopters. And one thing that I really like about SprintTax, which was a challenge with some of the other tax softwares that were out there, was that the state tax can be done through SprintTax, and that is really a positive thing. There's 50 different states and 50 different state tax situations, and it's hard enough to be somewhat knowledgeable about Massachusetts, let alone having to be somewhat knowledgeable about more than Massachusetts. And so being able to, my mantra at this time is always, I trust the software. If the software says you should do this, and the software is normally right. So it's nice to have that as a resource. And we also make sure that we know other resources. So whether it's knowing that the payroll folks in our school and who's issuing the W-2s and the 1042Ss. In Worcester, we had a local IRS office. So if you Google IRS in your state, you might be able to find some local contact information for some local offices. I think with COVID, some of those smaller local offices are either, I hope just temporarily closed, but sometimes they might have downsized. But I know that there's still offices in Boston and some other places, to see if you can get students connected to local resources if they have questions on where's my form, where's my refund, what should I do with something that's complicated. Our big things that we do are the tax workshops, having information available, pointing students towards SprintTax, and knowing some other local sources that are available. So our timeline essentially looks like this. And I know that Dawn's on this call. I feel like I borrowed some of the information that she has presented in the past, if this looks familiar to her. And I see that she's answering some of the questions in the chat. So thank you, Dawn, for helping us answer some questions. So preparing for tax season, we try to start with some conversations about taxes in August during our various international orientations for grad and undergrad students. We know that during orientation, they're inundated with like so much information, they're not necessarily processing it all, but we try and plant some seeds early. We also talk a little bit to our career development office that helps with internships and things like this. We don't expect that they're going to do any sort of tax advising, but if they know to maybe put in one of their slides, if they're doing a presentation for international students, a little note about if you are a non-resident alien, and you're going to be doing an internship, talk to the International House about FICA taxes, just to find different ways to plant the seeds. In December, we start to get everything organized for our Sprint tax situation for the year. So we determine the number of codes that we use, and then we connect with Sprint tax to purchase those. I think WPI probably uses our codes a little bit differently than some other schools. I think some schools get like one code for the whole university. So you'll have like one code that can be used 600 times. What we would do is we get individual codes so that we can help, so that we can distribute it to the students. We also let our alumni who are on OPT and still considered non-resident aliens, they could potentially reach out and get a code, but they have to ask for a code through a sign-up form that we have, and we distribute individual codes. In January, that's when we do all of our prepping of resources. So we update our tax website, we update our emails and newsletters and handouts, and we prepare the tax workshop. So the workshop has a PowerPoint and a handout that we give to students that they can kind of take notes as they go along about like, what is non-resident alien? What is a 1040 NR? What do I do with my W-2? What is a W-4? In February through April, that's tax season, of course, when we're notifying our students, facilitating the workshops, distributing the codes, and reminding students of tax deadlines. And then we added summer too, just because a lot of questions still come in the summer. And that's when the tax deadlines are, if they're getting a refund or if there's a problem, that's when the IRS is reaching out, or the local state is reaching out to follow up with information. So the tax questions don't just end because April 15th is gone. And then lastly, and I know that we're kind of running short on time here, just our goals. So for our students, the goals that we have when we're doing our tax paperwork is making sure that they, again, have that really basic knowledge. We're not talking about the ins and outs of all the forms. We just want them to know some really basic things so that they can understand their own status, much like what we would do with immigration documentation. The more that they know about their own status, the better they're able to advocate for themselves. We want them to know their tax status and when it changes. We want them to know about FICA, and we want them to know their resources. But for advisors, like I said before, the big thing is knowing your limits and what you should be sharing and what you could share and what you shouldn't be sharing. Going line by line on a tax form is definitely a big no-no. You know, looking at a number on a line and saying it should be this or that, that's not something you should be doing. Knowing your tax partners on campus, of course, and knowing your regional resources. Like I said, take a look and see, do you have a regional IRS office? What about your state office? For Massachusetts, the Department of Revenue? Are there people that you can reach out to for resources? Are there online web tools that you can use that might be free for students? And then lastly is just not being afraid. So there's this IRS publication 519, which is a tax guide for aliens. You don't have to memorize that entire tax guide in order to be to give basic tax advice. When I first started doing this, I knew absolutely nothing about non-resident alien taxes, but like somebody who is starting a job, they said, do you want to do this? You can be our point person at the school for this. And I said, sure, let me do some research. It's easy to be afraid of taxes, but it doesn't have to be scary. And you don't have to know every single thing. Some of the really basic stuff can get you a long way.
Great, thanks for that, Colleen. Much appreciated. So we'll finish up then on just the tax profile of the students and scholars that used us last year, just to show you what kind of refunds are out there. So for everyone that used us for a federal roughly 70% received a refund, and the average refund was $1,226. And on the state side, roughly 59% received a refund, and the average refund was $463. So it's definitely worth your while going in and advising an international student to do their taxes. Obviously, either way, it's important they do it anyway, and more so if they owe the IRS money. But this might also be an incentive for them to have a look and getting them started on the process. There's some resources here. NAFSA have some great resources. The IRS have some great publications and resources. And on top of that, Sprintax also have some good resources via our blogs and our YouTube videos, where we'll look at a hot tax topic and we'll post on that. I know we're short for time. I'm not too sure if we can slightly go over if that works for everybody, but I'm happy to take questions if anybody does have them. And just Dawn, I can see you're in the chat button there answering questions, so definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, we can dig in and see. I'm not exactly sure which ones have been answered and which ones haven't been answered. There were some questions about filing the A843. I think that was probably answered already. If you're filing the A843 and it's the only thing you're filing, you technically have until June 15th, although we tell students just get it done by April 15th, because you're going to forget after we stop talking about taxes to do it. If you're submitting it with the 1040 NR, then you file them together and it has to be done by April 15th.
There's a question just about kind of the eligibility for tax treaties between home country and the US. So really, we try not to go into that in too much detail when we're one-on-one with a student, because again, it depends on a lot of factors. And that's kind of, again, a free thing that Sprintax will do. You know, they can always go to the IRS publication where they can look, see their home country and see what are the conditions for a tax treaty to apply. But obviously that depends on whether they've used a tax treaty before. It'll depend on how long they've been in the US, what visa they're on. So they can do that research if they want to do that offline, or if they want to kind of, I suppose, cheat and kind of use the software without paying for it. If they don't want us to prepare their documents at the end, but want to know everything they need to know, they can go as far as the checkout screen, and we'll tell them what tax treaties apply. We'll tell them if they're due a refund, if they owe the IRS money, and basically all the important information without actually preparing their document. So if they really want the software to kind of look at all of their tax circumstances, that might be a good way of seeing if they are due any tax treaties.
Yeah, and tax treaty too are one of those things that I tell the students. It depends on the tax treaty as well, but for the most part, if they don't have the tax treaty applied at the beginning, it's easy to like get it through Sprintax at the end. For the most part, it's not like FICA where if you miss the boat, it's a real big pain to get it applied later on. So that's something good to know about taxes, the tax treaty.
Yeah, and there's a good question there. Just regards to the ITIN and the Social Security piece, and kind of what would you say to them to file later on? Put a note as to why, or advise they might get pinged for not filing on time. And Dawn, you said it, but it's true. You know, if the IRS owe them a refund, then there won't be any fines or penalties. But if they owe the IRS money, then there may be late filing fines or penalties. Now that's at the discretion at the IRS. We're hoping that, you know, if you attach a note and you say, listen, I actually couldn't do this because I physically didn't have an ITIN, they might be good, and they might see that because they're a non-resident, there aren't any fines or penalties. But really, I suppose that's between us. I wouldn't be telling a non-resident that, because it really is at the discretion of the IRS.
There was a question asking what's a great email address for Sprintax if somebody wanted to direct a question.
So I would say if it's anybody within the international office, feel free to reach out to me directly. I can put my email here. Obviously, just in terms of kind of student reach outs, we wouldn't be able to give our own emails out because there'd be 200,000 emails and they wouldn't get a response. But for any students that have questions, they can go to the live chat or hello@sprintax.com. And then for anybody else, you know, within the international office that might have a question, feel free to reach out to my email that I've just posted.
So I did have somebody ask me a Massachusetts state question that I can answer really quick. I know this isn't relevant for all the states that might be on the call. My understanding is that the threshold for filing is $8,000 in Massachusetts. So if you made less than $8,000, it's optional to file, but if you made more than $8,000, it's required to file. So a student who might only be here for 4 months and made less than $8,000, if they didn't have a chance to file the state tax, it might be less of an issue for them. But if they had any state tax taken out, they're not going to get any refund unless they file. So if you made less than $8,000, pretty much everything that was taken out in state tax would be refunded. So unless something has dramatically changed recently, I believe that's still the same for this person who asked the question.
Yeah, and it's a great point. And that is exactly how it stands. But for anyone that doesn't meet those thresholds, as you said, they're not going to get that refund back. Whereas
the government will happily keep the money if you don't request the refund back.
Absolutely. Like they don't mind. Great. So I think between Dawn and kind of the questions we have at the end, we've kind of got a lot of the questions covered. But just before we go, is there anything else that anyone wants answered?
Gold star to Dawn. I know she just got off, but we much appreciate her help with the questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dawn. We just have one quick look through. I think it seems like we do have everything.
Great. Well, I really want to thank Colleen and Neil for their informative presentation today. All of you will be receiving emails who are on the listserv of our super informative Wednesdays from Ozone, and it will tell you all the workshops that are coming up next. Next week, we have quite a few. There's one on Monday, beating back atrophy, and it's things we never had to do before. And we also have an H1B update on Thursday and F1 basics on Thursday and Friday. For those of you who would like to join that, you do have to register ahead of time because there's limited capacity. So thank you again to Colleen and Neil and Dawn if you're still on. And thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of the week.
Thanks everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.